Good evening, everyone. Hello, my name is Matthew, the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church. And every Tuesday night, we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, a text to study as we do our Bible study. We've had a little bit of a break for the last 3 weeks as I was away on a holiday in the Alps for a few days and did a bit of traveling about and meeting up with people and feel a little bit more refreshed, which is good. But also glad to be back again and be able to restart our Bible study where we picked off a number of weeks ago. And you remember that we were doing a Bible study series titled Journeying Through the Hebrew Bible, and we're looking at each of the individual books of the scriptures of the Old Testament, and we're looking particularly at how they apply to us in the Christian faith. We've seen that the Hebrew Bible is not a part of the Bible that we can just ignore and pretend is not there. Many Christians, in my view, erroneously believe, they say, well, because we're not under the Old Covenant, we're under the New Covenant, somehow the Old Testament is irrelevant to us. And that cannot be further from the truth. Okay? There is great truth in the stories and the pages of the Hebrew Bible that are relevant to us as believers in Christ and even relevant to the events that are happening in the world around us. And so it's important that we as believers in Christ have a good grasp of the teaching of the Old Testament. And we've seen that it is the literary framework of the New Testament. There's over 200 references in the New Testament to the Old Testament, and it's also the theological backdrop and background to the New Testament. So we wouldn't have any understanding of what sin is or what redemption is or what covenant is, all which are key ideas as New Testament believers if we're not for the pages of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Now, you remember that before my break, we looked at the first book of the Hebrew Bible, which is the book of Genesis, and we looked at the importance of Genesis and how it describes the universal problem of sin. But what I want to do tonight is, and next week as well, is we're going to look at the next book of the Bible, which is the book of Exodus. And the theme of Exodus is really about us being redeemed for a holy purpose. And really what we see in the book of Exodus, the teaching of Exodus or the message of Exodus, flows very well into Leviticus and to Numbers. In fact, those first 5 books of our Bibles, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, is sometimes called the Torah, which means instruction. And the narrative flows very well from Genesis into Exodus into Leviticus. And so what we see in the book of Exodus is that we see that there's a story of redemption, that God redeems his people for a purpose so that they can live righteously and live a holy life that is pleasing for him. And so we see here in the book of Exodus a picture of what God does for us in our lives. So they recall actual historical events that happened, but those events serve as a picture for us as believers of what God does to redeem us from our old life of sin to the newness of life that God has for us. And as I mentioned, all these books that make up the first 5 books of the Bible are what we call the Torah or instruction. And so when we come to Exodus particularly, we see that Exodus is a story of God delivering his people to bring them to a place of dependence upon him in the wilderness, to eventually lead them to a place of dominance where they take the land that God had promised Abraham and his descendants as their inheritance. So it moves from deliverance to dependence to dominance. Now, every nation that you would go to often has or most nations have a day in their calendar that is commemorative of their birth or when they came into existence or something significant. So the English are not so good at celebrating St. George's Day, but we have a St. George's Day. St. Andrew's Day in Scotland, St. David's Day in Wales, and St. Paddy's Day, or St. Patrick's Day, I call them, in Ireland. In America, if you was to go to visit the United States, you'll notice that every 4th of July, the Americans have their 4th of July celebrations and their Thanksgiving. And if you was to go there as a visitor and you was not aware of why they would celebrate these events, you'd want some sort of explanation as to why they celebrate the 4th of July and how that ties in to a strong sense of their national identity. Well, we so happen to have a people, mainly in the Middle East, but also across the world, who every year at about our March, April time, celebrate a feast called the Passover. And the Passover is really a story of the deliverance of the Jewish people, or the Hebrews as they were known, from Egypt into the promise that God had called them to have. And so the Jewish people celebrate the Passover as a commemoration of what God has done for them and delivering them. And it's a strong part of their national identity. And so really the book of Exodus gives us an explanation for why Jewish people do celebrate the Passover. And that ties very strongly into the key theme of the book of Exodus, which, as I mentioned, about redemption. And so as we look at the book of Exodus, we're going to be dividing this into two parts. Part one is about redemption, what God did to get the people, the children of Israel, out of slavery. And part two is about righteousness, how God wants his people to live now that they are free. And as we approach the book of Exodus, we'll discover that it's about God preparing his people for his arrival. That God wants to make a visitation with his people. He wants to be their king. He wants to be their God. He wants his people to be a kingdom of priests and the holy nation so that they can represent his glory. And God is delivering his people to bring them to a place of dependence on him so that God can make himself known to them and be present with them. And so as we look at the story of Exodus, we see that there's a move from two aspects. The story starts with redemption and it moves to righteousness. It moves from divine works of God to divine words, from grace of what God has done to save his people to gratitude and how we live our lives in response to what God has done, from liberation from Egypt to legislation in Sinai, from slavery to men to service to God. And really, that is a picture of the Christian life. If you ever look at the writings of Paul in his letters, you'll often notice that the first part of the letters is describing what God has done for us, what God has done to save us and to deliver us. And we see this particularly in a book like Galatians. Okay, so the first part is about what God has done, and our response to what God has done is in gratitude. So it's about what we believe or what Christ has accomplished on our behalf. But the second part of the letters is then about how should we live in response to what God has done. Okay, so that we're not saved by our good works, but we're saved for good works. And so we live our lives at a sense of gratitude for what God has done for us, but then we seek to live our lives righteously before God out of faith in what Jesus has done on our behalf. And that is the story of the book of Exodus, but it's also the story of the Christian life as well. Now, just before we delve into the first part of Exodus, that some scholars have claimed that because there's little archaeological evidence that there were ever any slaves in Egypt, or Hebrew slaves in particular, or events recording the stories of Exodus, that therefore it didn't happen. That's a bit hypocritical, because what you'll find is that in any major civilization throughout the world, whether it's the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Egyptians for that matter, they never recorded events of their defeats in battle, or they never recorded events of their own humiliation. So somehow scholars will say, because there's no evidence that the Hebrews were delivered out of Egypt, therefore it must not have happened. Well, in that case, you could apply that same rule to other civilizations as well, because there was no evidence that in the Babylonian records that they ever got defeated, or the Assyrian records that they ever got defeated. Never happened. So that's not true. Very often, ancient civilizations never recorded events of humiliation. And so it should come as no surprise that in the Egyptian records, there's little to no mention of the Hebrews. And that's not surprising, because they were greatly humiliated at what actually happened. In addition to that, it was traditionally believed that the Pharaoh at the time when the Hebrews came out of Egypt was Ramses II. However, work done by various scholars, such as David Roll, who wrote a book called A Test of Time, suggests that actually the Egyptian chronology that scholars used is off by a few hundred years. And instead of Ramses II being the pharaoh, it was more likely to have been a pharaoh by the name of Dudamos. And when that chronology was readjusted, suddenly a lot of things start to come to light from the archaeological record that shed more light on the Exodus story. And so the best, and in addition to that, the best historic record that we have of the Hebrews and their deliverance out of Egypt is actually the Bible itself, because the Bible has a time and again shown itself to be an accurate, reliable historical record of the events that happened. And so in the light of that, what we're going to do tonight, we're going to look at the first part of Exodus, which is about redemption. And then next week, we're going to look at the second part of Exodus, which is about righteousness. And so as we look at the story of redemption in the book of Exodus, the first thing we see is we see the object of redemption. You remember that a few weeks ago we saw that Jacob and his sons and his family moved from the land of Canaan into the land of Egypt and a place called Goshen in northern Egypt, which was one of the most fertile parts of Egypt. And they settled there for a few hundred years. And the reason for that, you remember, was because Joseph, who was the prime minister of Egypt at the time, rescued and saved Egypt from famine by building store cities during the years of plenty. And he invited his father and his family, 70 in all, to come to the land of Goshen and to settle. And so for the next about 400 years, a group of 70 people grew into a population of about 2.5 million Hebrews, descendants of Jacob. And we know that because in the book of Numbers, Numbers, as you can imagine, that's why it's called Numbers for some reason, the men of fighting age in the army of Israel, which was 600,000, which would indicate to us, if you take into consideration women and children, there have been about a population of 2.5 million people, or Hebrews, in the land of Egypt. And so immediately, the promise that God made to Abraham that he would have descendants as numerous like the stars in the heavens was starting to be fulfilled. Now here's the question. Why did Jacob's family, when they moved to the land of Goshen, why did they stay there? Why did they not go back to the land of Canaan after the famine? And there's two reasons for that. One is a human reason, because human nature being human nature, we get comfortable in our surroundings. And so what happened is that they went to the land of Goshen, they settled there, and they just got comfortable, and they didn't bother to go back to Canaan. But there's also a divine reason. God made it very clear to Abraham that he was going to destroy the inhabitants of the land of Canaan in an act of his judgment against human sin, wickedness, and depravity. So as God destroyed the earth with a flood because of human wickedness, and as God destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of human wickedness, so God was going to destroy the inhabitants who lived in the land of Canaan. And at the time, God said to Abraham, the wickedness of the people who are living here has not got to the point for me yet to judge this land. But in the time, in the next 400 years, I will judge this land. And he was going to use the Hebrews, the Israelites, as his instrument to bring his justice and judgment on the inhabitants of Canaan. And so that is why the descendants of Jacob stayed in the land of Goshen. And of course, during that time, they grew to a population of 2.5 million people. And a new Pharaoh came to power who forgot about Joseph, who didn't remember the kindness that Joseph showed to Egypt and saving Egypt. And he looked at the Hebrews, and being insecure, he felt threatened by them. And so he started to oppress the Hebrews. He subjected them to slave labor. He oppressed them brutally, and in the hope to try and decrease or suppress the numbers, he killed the male child of the Hebrew slaves. He forced them to make bricks without straw. And so during this time, there was great anguish amongst the Hebrews, and they groaned out and they cried out to God in their distress. And God heard the cry. God heard their distress. And so we see in the first part of Exodus the object of redemption. But this then leads us to the next part in chapters 2 and 4, to the means of redemption, because God was going to use a man by the name of Moses, who was of the tribe of Levi, to deliver his people from the hand of Pharaoh. And so Moses was born a Hebrew, as a male child. And of course, because of the danger upon his life due to Pharaoh's order to kill the Hebrew Bibles, he was placed by his mother into a papyrus basket. And interesting, in the Hebrew language, the word for the basket is the same word for ark. So you remember that God saved Noah and his family in an ark. So God will save Moses in an ark as well. And the ark, the basket was covered with pitch, as was Noah's ark. And so God saved Moses in this basket on the river Nile. And by the providence of God, he ended up being rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. And so Moses, as a child, grew up in the household of Pharaoh, and therefore he grew up as a prince of Egypt, even though he was still aware of his Hebrew identity. And so somehow, in the mercy of God, his life was not killed with the other Hebrew boys of his age. And so he grew up in the household of Pharaoh. And during that time, he clearly had a strong sense of his identity. He was a prince in Egypt, but he also was aware of his Hebrew roots. And then one day, and he also clearly had a sense that someday he would deliver his people. And then one day he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating up a Hebrew slave, and taking matters into his own hands, he then went to that taskmaster. He killed the Hebrew taskmaster, rescuing the slaves. The news of this got out to Pharaoh. Pharaoh issued a warrant upon his life to be put to death. Moses ran away, fled for his life, escaped to the land of Midian, which is now, in my view, in modern-day Saudi Arabia, where for the next 40 years, so he's 40 years of age when he killed this Egyptian taskmaster, but for the next 40 years, his stubborn pride will be broken in the wilderness. And during that time, he became a very humble man as he looked after sheep. He got married to a woman by the name of Zipporah, had 2 children with her. And then towards the end of those 40 years, when he's 80 years of age, God revealed himself again to Moses. He revealed himself to Moses, informing him that he was using him as his instrument to deliver his people, the Hebrews, out of Egypt. Moses, no longer the proud man he used to be, makes a list of excuses as to why he is not qualified to do this job, and as if he thinks he knows better than God. And God says, no, I've called you and appointed you to deliver my people out of Egypt. I've heard the cry, I've heard the groaning. And God says, I'll give you your brother Aaron to help you to confront Pharaoh. And so we move from the object to the means of redemption to the next part of the book of Exodus, to the power of redemption, which we see in chapters 5 to 11. And so Moses and Aaron confront Pharaoh, ordering him by God's authority to let the Hebrews go, that they may worship Yahweh, that they may worship the Lord. And Pharaoh hears this and thinks, who is this God? Who is this Yahweh that I should obey him? Pharaoh thought himself as a god. Pharaoh believed that he was a god, and he didn't think it was worthy to consider Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, to listen to him to let the Hebrews go. But by the end of this encounter, Pharaoh would soon know who really is God. And so what we see is that Moses directs Pharaoh to let God's people go. He says no. And so we have a series of 9 plagues in which God, Yahweh, displays his power against the deities and the false gods of Egypt, demonstrating that only Yahweh is the true God of this universe. And so when the Lord turns the Nile, the water of the Nile, to the blood, he is challenging the Egyptian god of Hapti, who is the god of the Nile. When God sends the frogs on the land of Egypt, he is challenging the Egyptian god of Heket, who had the face of a frog. When God turns the dust into gnats, God is challenging the Egyptian god of Geb, who is the god of the earth. And what was very interesting is that that Pharaoh's magicians could counterfeit God's miracles, but when it came to turning dust into gnats, they couldn't do it. They said, this is nothing but the hand of God. And so they realized that they were dealing with a being that is far superior than any of the Egyptian gods that they can and can't. So when the Lord sends flies, he is challenging the Egyptian god of Khepri, who is a beetle-like god, and undermining the creative powers of Khepri. When God sends the pestilence on the livestock, he is undermining the Egyptian god of Apis, who was a bull-like god. When he sends the boils on the skins of the people, he's challenging the god of Sekhmet, the goddess of disease and healing. When he sends the hail, God is challenging the god of Nut, the god of the sky. And when the Lord sends the locusts, he is challenging the Egyptian god of Serek, who is meant to protect the crops. And finally, when God sends darkness over the land, he is saying that the Egyptian god of Ra is no god of all, who is meant to be the god of light. And so what we see here is that the plagues of God, the power of God is demonstrating to the Egyptians, your gods are all false. Your gods have no power, because really they're false gods compared to Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. Now, what's very interesting is that every time that God sends these plagues, that Pharaoh would relent and say, okay, I'll let your people go, that they may worship the Lord, but then he changes his mind and he hardens his heart. And we see it throughout this, that each time Pharaoh is hardening his heart, but eventually a point comes when God, in judgment to Pharaoh, hardens his heart for him. And so God never hardened his heart initially. It was Pharaoh who hardened his own heart. And then in judgment, God said, well, if that's the way you want to go, I'll help you along the way, and I'll harden it for you, so that God may display his wonders in Egypt, and so that the Lord may show the Egyptians who the true God really is. That Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, is the true God of this whole universe. And so God judged the gods of Egypt. And what this simply shows is this, that if we persistently harden our heart towards God, eventually a point will come when God will harden our hearts for us, if we are determined to live in rebellion to God and not listen to him. And we see that particularly in the book of Romans chapter 1, where the Bible reveals that God revealed himself, he made himself clear, he made himself known to the earth, and people willfully chose to ignore God. And therefore God says, okay, if that's the way you want it, I'll help you along that way. I'll harden your heart for you. And so we see this is a story of redemption of the Hebrews in the first part of the book of Exodus. And it is also a picture of the Christian journey as well, of what God has done for us, for those of us who put our trust in Jesus. As the Hebrews were under slavery, so we were at one point under slavery to the principles of this world. So at one point we were in slavery to the powers of darkness in this world. As Moses was a tool of God's redemption in delivering God's people out of Egypt, so Christ is our Redeemer. He is our means of redemption. Now, Moses was not perfect by any means, but his life served as a picture of a shadow of Jesus. In fact, in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 11, or 9 I should say, Jesus was transfigured of Moses and Elijah. And Luke records that Jesus was talking about the exodus he was about to bring in Jerusalem, that Christ would go to the cross to deliver the whole of humanity from slavery to sin. And we also see, as God displayed his power against the gods of Egypt and had victory over the gods of Egypt, so also Christ's power is greater than Satan's power. Christ and Christ alone has the power to grant us salvation. However, there was one other plague that was about to happen before the Hebrews could step into the freedom that God had for them. And we're going to look at that plague next week as we continue a story looking through the Hebrew Bible and particularly through the book of Exodus. Well, guys, that's the thought to think about. A question to ponder is this: can you recall something from your previous life that God has saved you from? What was it, and how has your life been different since? So can you recall something from your previous life that God has saved you from? What was it, and how is your life different since? And from the text study, I'd like you to read Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 to 19. What could Pharaoh's magicians do and not do? So what could Pharaoh's magicians do and not do? And what does this tell you about Satan's power compared to God's? Guys, hope you got something out of that. Hey, listen, have a great rest of the day. Looking forward to seeing you later on in the week. God bless you all.